I am Doomsvince, and this is day 145 of Spawn Year.
Brian Haberlin is having so much fun playing in the sandbox, I wonder if he was ever invited to write for Spawn again. His story is set around the pivotal central event of Al Simmons' recruitment into Malebolgia's army, and it's not boring or stolid. By the end, of course, the whole thing turns out to be pretty superfluous, but there's at least some energy and cleverness that's often lacking in these books, especially when it has anything to do with Al Simmons. There's also a little more to this little two-parter than I originally thought, but not by much. Haberlin's approach to Spawn is closer to what I wish McFarlane's was. He doesn't borrow a lot from the Bible, but his story serves to quickly riff on major beats like God working in mysterious ways. McFarlane tends to avoid biblical stuff. When Bolgi took notice of Abdiel last issue, it was because he defeated Lilith in battle. Abdiel's cover as a fallen angel is still intact, and Bolgi deputizes him, giving him Lilith's job or something similar. He isn't titled Duchess or Duke for that matter, so I'm not sure. After 6 months policing hell, Abdiel gets impatient and wonders when his superiors are going to hurry up and give the high sign. Haberlin competently pays off this undercover operation having to take place so close to Al's draft pick when Heaven's intelligence reveals that Al is the whole reason for the mission in the first place. Sticking close to the messy mythology in the main title, Abdiel is supposed to nab Al and bring him to heaven after killing Malebolgia. Finally, the whole thing is aborted when it turns out, as Bolgi alludes to in his long speech about how nobody working for heaven really knows or understands God's will, that God actually wants Al to become a Spawn, and this whole mission, like many I'd wager, is some desk jockey's gross misinterpretation of God's will. So Abdiel leaves hell and makes God's secretary, yeah, God has a secretary, send him in to see God without an appointment. Abdiel asks God point blank if he's doing God's will, and God, who either forgot to pay his light bill or stayed in the void even after he came up with creation, yells no, big enough probably to take up the whole New York City skyline if they were in New York City. There's a lot of talk about how Abdiel used to be a poet. That must have been before he was all uptight and brutish, and how he's been a soldier so long he can't write a single line. So, near as I can figure, God intended for him to remain a poet, and he took the wrong path. It's a little unclear what the story is getting at with this point, but the main point, now that it has one, is plain as day. Maybe just because God created the universe might not mean he's perfect and all-wise. Now, this whole thing may be intended as a criticism against Christianity, which I think McFarlane wanted to avoid so as not to alienate his religious audience. But it's so exaggerated and silly, it's easy for me to take it on its own terms and leave actual religion out of it, and one could make the case that this God is nothing like the biblical one. Working for this overly complicated, bureaucratic heaven is a nightmare, and Malebolgia actually makes a fair argument against the way God is running things. The notion of taking everything on faith in this version extends to God's army. Everyone's guessing, never totally sure if they're doing what God wants, and Bolgi suggests the whole war is silly because if God didn't want certain people to exist, they wouldn't exist, and he compares that convoluted system to hell's, saying, here, there's a loose order to things. Do what you want if you can get away with it. After all this talk about how there are all these shades of gray between heaven and hell, this is the very first time I thought hell really had a point over heaven, that they weren't both totally awful and just waving flags that say good or evil. Oh, Bolgi is still certainly evil. He manipulates Abdiel into standing up to God so he'll get sent back to hell and Malebolgia can recruit him. He keeps Spawn costumes in boxes tied up with ribbon. This Bolgi is barrels of fun. But there's also truth to what he's saying. All this leads Abdiel to basically say what I did last entry. Between the two, heaven is less competent. I wonder if Haberlin isn't poking fun at McFarlane a little. In the same story where his main character throws his hands in the air because he can't make heads or tails of God's insanely confusing plans, we see Bolgi successfully manipulate someone into doing what he wants by preying on their sensibilities, and in only 2 issues. I'd love to see what this guy could do with the main title. Since Abdale wasn't even supposed to be there and Heaven ultimately allowed Al's murder and recruitment by Malbolgia to occur unfettered, none of this really matters at all. But I enjoyed the social commentary, however thin, of the bureaucracy that's so congested and unnecessarily complicated that nothing can get done because there's no communication, versus the totally undisciplined, almost anarchy of a business that lets everyone do whatever they want with no oversight except punishment from an injured individual to whoever injured them, which amounts to about the same. Except, at least just looking at these two comics, hell almost looks like the friendlier workplace. I realize evil is often more enticing than good, but again, we find that perhaps good here isn't as good as it's supposed to be. Abdale, by the end, is a mirror for Spawn, a guy who thought he was playing for the right side, got sucked into hell, and decided to go his own way and serve justice rather than a master. Hey, you really can do that whole story in 2 issues. Why did it take McFarlane 76 to get to that point? Signed, Captain Logan.